That cheap rag does not belong in our mansion." My mother's voice sliced through the low murmur of the 60 guests standing in the grand foyer, cutting through the ambient sound of a hired string quartet playing softly in the corner. I stood near the entrance of my parents' $4 million estate, my hand resting protectively on the shoulder of my 8-year-old son, Leo. The contrast between us and the rest of the room was stark and deeply uncomfortable. We were surrounded by imported Italian marble floors that gleamed under the light of massive crystal chandeliers. Those chandeliers alone cost more than the down payment on my first house. The guests were a sea of designer suits and custom silk gowns, people wearing watches and jewelry that could easily pay off an average family's 30-year mortgage. It was Richard and Margaret's 40th wedding anniversary gala. They had spared absolutely no expense to prove to the world, and to themselves, that they were undeniable royalty in this upscale Texas suburb. Valets had sneered when I handed over the keys to my 10-year-old truck, parking it far out of sight behind a line of spotless European luxury vehicles. Waitstaff in crisp black vests and white gloves circulated silently, carrying silver trays loaded with expensive champagne flutes and tiny, intricate appetizers that tasted like nothing. I hated every single second of being in this house. I am a digital forensics engineer. My entire life revolves around analyzing raw data, tracking deleted files across hidden networks, and finding the ugly, undeniable truth buried deep behind corporate firewalls. I deal strictly with facts, logic, and evidence. This room, however, was a towering monument to fiction. It was an illusion of perfection maintained by two people who cared only about optics. My parents had always despised my wife, Olivia. They labeled her a gold digger from the very first day I introduced her, simply because she worked long hours as a registered nurse and came from a modest, working-class neighborhood in the city. They never missed an opportunity to remind her of her place, utilizing 1,000 tiny, passive-aggressive cuts over the years. Even after Olivia died of pancreatic cancer 2 years ago, their disdain did not fade or soften into grief. It just shifted its focus. Tonight, that focus was aimed directly at the carefully folded blanket clutched tightly to Leo's small chest. It was a handmade quilt. Olivia had spent her final, agonizingly painful months sewing it, stitch by careful stitch, sitting in a chair by the window while the brutal chemotherapy ravaged her failing body. It was a beautiful pattern of blue and white, covered in intricately pieced stars, and it still smelled faintly of her lavender perfume and the cedar chest where I kept it safe. Leo refused to sleep without it. He carried it everywhere when he was anxious, and tonight, he insisted on bringing it because he was terrified of the large, cold, echoing rooms of his grandparents' house and the strangers staring at him. Margaret noticed the quilt the moment we stepped through the heavy oak double doors. She wore a deep emerald silk gown that looked heavy and restrictive, her neck weighed down by a fortune in diamonds that caught the light with every subtle movement. She excused herself from a circle of local politicians and walked deliberately over to us. Her smile was perfectly rehearsed for the onlookers, but her eyes were pure, unadulterated ice. She looked at the quilt in my son's arms like it was a dead animal rotting on her pristine floor. She leaned down, the heavy scent of her expensive perfume rolling over us, and asked Leo why he was dragging that filthy, contaminated thing into her beautiful home. I stepped forward immediately, placing myself slightly between them, and told her quietly that it was his mother's quilt. It comforted him, and he was going to hold on to it. Margaret's fake, practiced smile stretched so thin it looked painful. She stood back up and turned her full attention to me, her voice dropping to that specific, condescending whisper she used when she wanted to cut incredibly deep without making a scene that the politicians might overhear. She looked me up and down and said we were raising our only grandson with high class and dignity, not clinging to the pathetic, germ-infested scraps of a woman who never belonged in our family to begin with. Before I could even process the sheer, breathtaking cruelty of her words, Margaret reached out with a sudden, vicious movement and snatched the quilt directly from Leo's hands. She ripped it away with such force that Leo stumbled forward, gasping in shock as his mother's last gift was torn from his grip. Richard, my father, materialized seemingly out of nowhere to stand right beside her. He held a heavy crystal glass of expensive scotch in his right hand and wore a deeply smug, satisfied expression, clearly approving of his wife's aggressive boundary setting. The massive fireplace in the center of the living room was roaring. It was a decorative, floor-to-ceiling stone monstrosity, and because the Texas evening had a slight chill, the flames were burning high and bright, throwing dancing shadows across the polished marble. Margaret did not even hesitate for a fraction of a second. She walked 3 purposeful steps toward the open hearth, turned around just long enough to ensure she had my complete and utter attention, and threw the quilt directly into the center of the roaring fire. The flames caught the frayed, well-loved edges of the cotton fabric immediately. The beautiful blue and white star pattern began to curl and blacken as the intense heat consumed the material. The last physical piece of my wife, the countless hours of devotion, love, and physical pain she poured into that blanket, was rapidly turning into gray ash on a billionaire's marble floor. Leo let out a sound that I will never, ever forget for as long as I live. It was not a normal child's cry. It was the visceral, agonizing sound of a little boy's heart breaking completely in half. He screamed for his mother, the sound tearing through the elegant room. The string quartet in the corner stopped playing abruptly, the cellist's bow hovering over the strings. 60 wealthy, influential guests turned their heads to watch the spectacle unfold. Margaret stood tall by the fire, smoothing the front of her silk dress, looking immensely satisfied with her display of absolute authority. She looked down at my sobbing son, told him strictly to stop crying making a scene, and promised she would buy him a proper, sanitary Egyptian cotton blanket tomorrow morning. She announced to the silent room that they simply do not keep garbage in this house. I did not scream. I did not curse at her. I did not throw a punch. In my specialized line of work, when a secure system is breached by a hostile entity, panic is your absolute worst enemy. Anger makes you sloppy, predictable, and weak. You do not react emotionally to the hacker. You lock down the network, you isolate the threat, and you extract the critical data. My mind went completely, terrifyingly cold. I walked right past my mother, ignoring her entirely. The heat radiating from the massive stone fireplace was intense, baking against my face and chest. The quilt was actively burning now, the synthetic batting deep inside beginning to melt, releasing a thick, acrid smoke into the room. I reached directly into the rolling orange flames. I did not use the heavy iron tongs sitting neatly on the hearth. I needed to feel it. I grabbed the burning fabric with my bare hands. The fire bit into the soft flesh of my palms and the insides of my fingers instantly. The physical pain was sharp, absolute, and incredibly grounding. I yanked the heavy quilt out of the fireplace and dropped it forcefully onto the imported Persian rug. I stomped out the remaining, stubborn flames with the heavy soles of my work boots, leaving thick black soot, melted fibers, and ash ground deeply into Margaret's pristine, priceless floor. I picked up the ruined quilt. One entire corner was completely charred and blackened, but the thick, densely packed layers of heavy cotton had prevented the fire from immediately reaching the center. My hands were throbbing with a violent, pulsing rhythm, the skin already turning an angry, furious red and beginning to blister across the knuckles. I turned slowly to look at my parents. Richard stepped forward. His face flushed a dark, furious red, not out of any parental concern for my burning flesh, but purely because I had ruined the flawless aesthetic of his high society party and stained his expensive rug. He pointed a rigid finger directly at my chest and told me my behavior was absolutely unhinged. He announced loudly to the dead silent room that I had completely lost my grip on reality ever since Olivia passed away. He lowered his voice, stepping closer so only I could hear the venom, and told me that if I kept acting like an unstable, violent lunatic in public, he would involve his corporate lawyers and have me involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility. He said Leo needed a stable, wealthy environment to thrive, and clearly, a man who shoves his bare hands into a fire is legally unfit to provide one. He was threatening to take my son. He was openly planning to use my grief and my desperate reaction to his wife's unspeakable cruelty as documented medical evidence for a hostile conservatorship. I looked around at the affluent people staring at us, holding their champagne flutes. Not a single person stepped forward to intervene. They were all silent, complicit participants in this sick hierarchy of wealth. I looked back at Richard, my expression blank. I did not argue. I did not bother defending myself to a room full of cowards. I simply told him we were leaving. I walked over to Leo, who was frozen in absolute shock, silent tears streaming steadily down his pale face. I knelt down, completely ignoring the searing, blinding pain in my hands, and wrapped my right arm tightly around his small shoulders. I tucked the smoking, ruined quilt securely under my left arm and walked straight out the front door, not looking back once. The drive back to our small 3-bedroom house took exactly 45 agonizing minutes. The sharp, bitter smell of burnt cotton and melted synthetic fibers filled the small cabin of my old truck, making the air heavy and hard to breathe. Leo sat rigidly in the passenger seat, quietly sobbing into the seatbelt, clutching the unburned side of the thick quilt tightly to his chest like a life preserver. I kept my eyes locked on the dark, empty stretches of the Texas highway. My mind was racing at 1,000 miles an hour, systematically analyzing every single word Richard had spoken during his little performance. The threat of a forced psychiatric conservatorship was not an idle, heat-of-the-moment boast. My parents possessed the kind of generational wealth and political influence to drag me into a brutal, drawn-out legal battle that could ruin me. They could easily afford to bribe unethical psychiatrists, hire the most ruthless family law firms in the state, and carefully paint a narrative of me as a grieving, incompetent, and dangerous father who needed to be stripped of his parental rights for the good of the child. When we finally parked in our cracked concrete driveway, the silence of our neighborhood felt like a blessing. I unbuckled Leo, lifted him carefully into my arms, and carried him inside the house. It was quiet, modest, and safe, a stark contrast to the echoing, hostile museum of my parents' mansion. I settled Leo into his bed, pulling his regular blankets up to his chin, and promised him repeatedly that the star quilt was safe and that Grandma was still watching over him from heaven. It took nearly an hour of sitting in the dark, rubbing his back, before he finally exhausted himself and cried himself to sleep. Once I was sure he was deeply asleep, I walked slowly into the kitchen. I turned on the sink faucet and held my trembling hands under the freezing, rushing water. The painful blisters had already fully formed across my palms, my thumbs, and the insides of my fingers. The physical pain was severe, sharp enough to make my vision blur slightly at the edges, but it was absolutely nothing compared to the cold, heavy realization currently settling deep in the center of my chest. For 42 years, I had diligently played the assigned role of the good, compliant son. I swallowed my pride when they insulted my career choice, telling their friends I was just a glorified computer repairman instead of a senior forensic engineer. I kept the peace at family gatherings when they made snide, passive-aggressive comments about the size of my house or the make of my vehicle. I endured their endless, exhausting lectures about legacy, high society, and status because I foolishly believed that family, no matter how deeply flawed or toxic, was supposed to stick together. But tonight, that pathetic illusion shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. Watching Margaret literally throw Olivia's dying effort into a fireplace, watching Richard threaten to steal my only son simply to punish me for defying them, I finally saw them for what they truly were. In the field of forensic psychology, there is a specific clinical term for people exactly like my parents. Malignant narcissists. They do not view the world through a lens of empathy or human connection. They view it purely in terms of power dynamics, leverage, and possession. People are not autonomous individuals to them. They are either useful assets to be exploited or obstacles to be destroyed. Olivia was an obstacle because she refused to bow to them, and because they could not control her with their money. Leo, however, was a highly valuable asset. He was a prop they could dress up and use to display their perfect, continuous lineage to their country club friends. I was merely the frustrating middleman they needed to legally bypass to get what they wanted. Standing there in the dim, yellow light of my kitchen, feeling the icy tap water numb my burned, ruined skin. The very last shred of familial loyalty I held for Richard and Margaret evaporated into the air. They had crossed the absolute final boundary. They had threatened the safety and future of my son. If they wanted a full-scale war over Leo, they had chosen the absolute wrong adversary. They genuinely thought I was just a sad, grieving, easily intimidated widower. They did not understand what a digital forensic engineer actually does every single day. I spend my life dismantling the complex digital lives of sophisticated corporate fraudsters. I locate the hidden money people desperately try to conceal. I trace the encrypted offshore accounts, the layered dummy corporations, and the deleted, highly sensitive communications. I legally ruin wealthy criminals for a living using nothing but raw data. I turned off the faucet and gently patted my hands dry with a clean paper towel. I looked at the charred quilt resting on the kitchen table. The smell of smoke still clung to it tightly. My parents had always wielded their vast wealth like a blunt weapon. But wealth leaves a massive, undeniable paper trail. Every transaction, every mortgage, every wire transfer leaves a permanent digital footprint. The good, obedient son died tonight. Tomorrow morning, the auditor wakes up. I sat down heavily at the small wooden kitchen table, staring blankly at the burnt, blue and white fabric of the quilt. The sharp smell of the smoke acted as a trigger, and the memory of Olivia's last, agonizing days hit me with the sudden, devastating force of a physical blow. 2 years ago, the pancreatic cancer had spread aggressively and without mercy through her body. The exhausted oncology doctors at the hospital had pulled me into a sterile hallway and given us a terminal timeline measured only in short, painful weeks. There was, however, one final, desperate option. An experimental immunotherapy trial was being conducted at a specialized research facility down in Houston. Because it was highly experimental, it was absolutely not covered by our standard health insurance policy. The out-of-pocket cost was exactly $60,000, and the doctors were blunt. It only offered a 20% chance at extending her life by maybe 6 to 8 months. I had already completely drained our joint savings and maxed out our credit cards trying to keep up with the mounting medical bills and copays. I was desperate, so I did something I had sworn to myself I would never, ever do. I drove to my parents' estate and went to my father to ask for a loan. Richard sat comfortably behind his massive, polished mahogany desk in his sprawling home office. He did not look at me with the sympathy or terror of a father whose daughter-in-law was dying. He looked at me with the cold, calculating eyes of a bank manager assessing a very high-risk, low-reward loan applicant. I explained the trial, the cost, and the slim percentage of hope it offered. He steepled his fingers together, leaned back in his leather chair, and sighed. He told me that $60,000 was a significant amount of liquid capital to move on short notice. He looked me dead in the eye and said, and I will remember the exact, sterile phrasing until the day I die, that investing that kind of money into a definitively terminal case was simply not a sound financial decision. He talked about return on investment, on a human life. He completely refused to write the check. He made the conscious, calculated decision to let my wife die faster in order to save a fraction of what he routinely spent on upgrading his luxury vehicles. When I drove back to the hospital, walking into the room smelling of harsh antiseptic and listening to the steady beep of the heart monitor, I broke down. I sat beside her bed and told Olivia that we couldn't get the money. She did not cry. She did not express anger or surprise. She just reached out with her frail, bruised hand and held mine tightly. Her skin was incredibly pale, her body visibly wasting away, but her spirit remained forged from pure steel. She had worked as a dedicated hospice nurse for over 15 years. She knew the brutal, unfiltered reality of death better than anyone in our family. She pulled me close to her face and whispered, her voice raspy but firm, that we did not need his money. She said his wealth was poison to the root. Every single dollar they ever gave anyone came with a heavy iron chain attached, and she absolutely refused to let them wrap those chains around our son's neck. During those final, terrible weeks, she spent every single waking hour she could manage working on that quilt. Her fingers were swollen from the fluid retention, her breathing was terribly labored, and the pain medications made her dizzy, but she flatly refused to stop sewing. I watched her struggle, begging her to rest, asking her why she was pushing her failing body so incredibly hard for a blanket. She looked up at me with a fierce, burning intensity in her sunken eyes and said it was for Leo. She said it was going to be his armor when she was gone. She gripped my shirt and made me swear, swearing on her actual life, that I would never, under any circumstances, let my parents take the quilt away from him. She said they would eventually try to erase her memory from his life, to replace her with expensive toys, and this quilt was the one true thing they could not simply buy and throw away. I distinctly remember the heavy rain beating aggressively against the hospital window the night she finally passed away. The room was dark, lit only by the monitors. She pulled my head down close to her lips, using the very last ounce of her strength, and whispered that Leo's ultimate freedom was sewn deep into the stars. I honestly thought she was just speaking metaphorically, a dying mother's poetic, emotional goodbye to the family she was leaving behind. But as I sat in the present, running my bandaged, throbbing hand over the thick, unburned section of the blanket on my kitchen table, my fingers pressing into the unusually stiff batting, I realized something vital. Olivia never, ever spoke in metaphors. She was a deeply practical, pragmatic woman who always planned for the absolute worst-case scenario. She knew exactly what Richard and Margaret were capable of, and she knew they would eventually come for Leo. She hadn't just made a blanket. She had prepared a defense. The very next morning, after making Leo a quiet breakfast and dropping him off at the front gates of his elementary school, I drove my truck straight to West Magnolia Avenue. I parked on the street outside a small, colorfully cluttered shop owned by a woman named Maggie Chun. Maggie had been Olivia's closest, most trusted friend and her partner in a local weekend quilting circle for over a decade. If there was anyone on earth who knew how to carefully take apart this complex blanket without accidentally destroying whatever was hidden inside of it, it was her. The brass bell above the glass door chimed loudly as I walked in. The shop smelled like fresh cotton and hot iron steam. Maggie looked up from her large wooden cutting table, a pair of heavy fabric scissors in her hand. Her warm expression instantly dropped, replaced by sheer horror when she saw the thick, white medical bandages wrapped around my hands and the charred, soot-stained fabric tucked securely under my arm. I set the ruined quilt gently down on her cutting table. I did not sugarcoat it. I told her exactly what happened at the anniversary party. I told her what Margaret said about Olivia, and I told her about Richard's explicit threat regarding the conservatorship. Maggie's jaw tightened so hard I thought her teeth might crack. She had always known exactly how toxic and cruel my parents were, having listened to Olivia vent about them for years. She reached out and gently ran her hands over the burned, brittle edges of the fabric, her eyes tearing up, before her fingers brushed against the thick, unnaturally hard lump buried in the very center star of the pattern. She looked up at me, her breath catching audibly in her throat. Without saying a single word, she walked over to her tool drawer and pulled out a small, razor-sharp metal seam ripper. She looked at the quilt, then at me, and spoke in a hushed whisper. She told me that Olivia had come into this exact shop just a week before she was admitted into the hospital for the final time. Olivia had specifically asked to use the heavy-duty industrial sewing machine located in the back room, a machine capable of sewing through thick leather and canvas. She had locked the door behind her and worked entirely alone for over 3 hours. Maggie said she never asked what Olivia was doing back there. It was an unspoken rule of respect between them. If Olivia needed privacy, she got it. Maggie put on a pair of reading glasses and began to carefully, meticulously slice the tiny, tight stitches along the outer edge of the large, central star pattern. The entire process was agonizingly, frustratingly slow. Every tiny snap of the heavy cotton thread sounded incredibly loud in the quiet, tense atmosphere of the shop. I stood there, my heart pounding a heavy rhythm against my ribs, watching her work. After 10 long minutes, she successfully folded back the top layer of scorched, blue cotton. Underneath the standard, soft quilt batting was something completely unexpected. It was a thick, flat, heavy package, wrapped tightly and repeatedly in heavy-duty, waterproof industrial plastic. It was completely sealed on all sides with thick strips of reinforced duct tape. My mouth went completely dry. Maggie carefully lifted the heavy package out of the fabric cavity and handed it across the table to me. Her hands were physically shaking. She stepped back, giving me space to process whatever I was holding. Because my hands were heavily bandaged and clumsy, I awkwardly pulled a small pocket knife from my jeans and carefully sliced through the tough layers of tape and plastic. Inside the waterproof sleeve were several thick, heavy stacks of official legal documents, all neatly organized and securely paper-clipped together. The paper smelled faintly of age, ink, and the lavender from the quilt. I pulled out the first thick stack of papers. The document on top was a formal property deed, officially registered and stamped in Travis County, Texas. It bore the raised gold seal of the state. I read the dense text, my eyes frantically scanning the complex legal jargon. It was a warranty deed for 200 acres of prime, undeveloped land located right along the Colorado River, situated just outside the city limits of Austin. The legal owner listed on the document was not a person, but an irrevocable trust. I scanned down to the beneficiary section. The sole, exclusive beneficiary of that trust was Leo. The legally appointed trustee holding full administrative control was me. I looked at the signature at the extremely bottom of the page. It was Olivia's familiar, elegant handwriting, formally notarized and officially dated 12 years ago. I literally could not breathe. The air felt like it had been sucked entirely out of the room. I quickly pulled out the next document in the stack, my bandaged fingers fumbling with the heavy paper. It was another officially stamped deed. This one was for 152 acres of land, legally adjoining the first massive parcel. It was registered to the exact same trust, with the exact same beneficiary. I dug deeper into the waterproof envelope and found a formal, 50-page appraisal document from a highly reputable commercial real estate firm based in Dallas, dated exactly 3 years ago. The total combined land mass owned by the trust was 352 acres. I know the commercial real estate market in the Austin area very well. Over the last decade, massive tech companies had flooded into the region, buying up property and turning seemingly empty, useless ranch land into absolute gold. I pulled my smartphone out of my pocket with trembling fingers and ran a quick, targeted search on current, up-to-date land values in that specific river corridor. Major commercial developers were currently buying similar parcels at nearly $90,000 an acre. I closed my eyes and did the terrifying math in my head. 352 acres. The undeveloped land sitting quietly in my 8-year-old son's trust was currently worth over $32 million. I leaned heavily against Maggie's wooden cutting table. The entire room seemed to spin. How in the world was this financially possible? Olivia was a registered nurse. We lived paycheck to paycheck for almost the entirety of our marriage, stressing over grocery bills and car repairs. At the very bottom of the plastic sleeve, resting beneath the deeds, I found a handwritten letter on Olivia's personal, floral stationery. I unfolded it carefully. The letter was addressed directly to me. Her handwriting was perfectly steady. She wrote that she knew, with absolute certainty, that Richard and Margaret would eventually try to use their immense wealth to completely control our lives. She knew they would ultimately try to buy Leo's loyalty and brutally punish me if I ever dared to step out of line or defy them. So, over 15 years ago, long before she even got sick, she quietly started working double shifts. She volunteered for every terrible holiday rotation, took every single available hour of overtime, and accepted exhausting private in-home care nursing jobs on her days off. She lived incredibly frugally, quietly hiding the extra, untracked income in a completely separate standalone bank account I knew nothing about. Through her private care work, she found an elderly, desperate rancher outside Austin who was quietly selling off his massive, unwanted land piece by piece to pay for his dying wife's expensive medical care. Olivia became his wife's dedicated private nurse, and in exchange for her tireless care, he sold her the land at a massive fraction of its actual cost, letting her pay off the balance slowly, month by month, over an entire decade. She bought it all in absolute secret. She set up the ironclad trust through a fiercely independent lawyer who hated my father's firm. She wrote that she desperately wanted Leo to have a permanent, unbreakable shield. $32 million was more than enough money to ensure that my toxic parents could never, ever financially control him. It was absolute, undeniable freedom, bought and paid for with 15 years of a mother's quiet exhaustion, physical pain, and unimaginable sacrifice. I stood there, staring blindly at the letter. My parents had constantly, viciously called her a gold digger. They treated her like a pathetic, grasping peasant trying desperately to steal a piece of their precious fortune. Meanwhile, she had quietly, methodically built a massive financial empire for her son right under their arrogant noses, using absolutely nothing but her own blood, sweat, and endless, fierce love. I carefully folded the irreplaceable documents and placed them safely back into the thick plastic sleeve. I looked over at Maggie, who was openly weeping, wiping tears from her face with a scrap of cotton. The heavy, suffocating grief that had lived in my chest for 2 years was suddenly, violently replaced by a cold, terrifying, and razor-sharp clarity. My parents wanted to start a war over assets and control. They were about to learn the hard way that they were completely and utterly outgunned. I drove my truck straight from the Seamstress shop in Fort Worth directly to the downtown high-rise office of Sophia Martinez. Sophia was a ruthless, brilliant former federal prosecutor who had recently transitioned into high-stakes family law. She did not play nice, she did not care about social niceties, and above all else, she did not lose. I walked past her receptionist, stepped into her sleek, glass-walled office, placed the plastic-wrapped stack of documents directly onto her desk, and thoroughly explained the entire situation. I told her in detail about the disgusting incident at the anniversary party, showed her my severely burned hands, and relayed Richard's explicit, calculated threat to file for a forced medical conservatorship in order to legally take Leo away from me. Sophia put on her glasses and meticulously reviewed the deeds, the property appraisals, and the incredibly complex trust documents. Her professional expression remained completely neutral, giving nothing away, but her dark eyes sharpened noticeably as she absorbed the sheer scale of the assets. After 20 minutes of reading, she looked up and confirmed that the trust was absolutely bulletproof. Olivia had used a top-tier, incredibly expensive estate firm in Austin to draft the paperwork. The trust was strictly irrevocable. Richard and Margaret had absolutely zero legal claim to the land, the trust itself, or the $32 million. However, Sophia leaned forward, folding her hands, and warned me that Richard's threat of a conservatorship was actually standard, highly effective operating procedure for toxic, wealthy families looking to seize control. She carefully explained the legal mechanics of his plan. If Richard somehow found out about this incredibly valuable land, he would not waste his time or money trying to break an unbreakable trust in civil court. He would try to completely break me in family court. He would immediately file an ex parte emergency petition with a friendly judge, officially claiming that I was completely mentally unstable and a severe danger to my child. He would heavily utilize the dramatic incident at the party, specifically the act of me plunging my bare hands into a roaring fire, as undeniable, documented evidence of severe psychological distress and self-harm. He would use his vast resources to hire a corrupt, highly paid psychiatrist to officially diagnose me with complicated grief syndrome or erratic, dangerous behavior. If a judge granted him temporary conservatorship over my person, he would automatically, by default, become the managing trustee of Leo's assets. He would gain total control of the $32 million. As if on perfectly timed, dramatic cue, my smartphone vibrated aggressively in my pocket. It was a high-priority email notification. I opened it with a bandaged thumb. It was a formal, heavily worded legal letter from one of the most expensive, aggressive family law firms in Dallas, a firm known for representing billionaires. They were formally notifying me of their immediate intent to file for emergency guardianship of Leo, citing a dangerous, unstable, and psychologically abusive home environment. The email concluded with a hard demand that I submit to a full psychological evaluation by their chosen doctor within exactly 48 hours, or they would request police intervention to remove the child. They were moving incredibly fast. They wanted to completely blindside me with legal paperwork and fear before I could even secure proper legal counsel or formulate a defense. They were actively trying to gaslight me into terrified submission. I turned the phone around and showed the email directly to Sophia. She leaned back in her expensive leather chair, let out a sharp breath, and said we needed to build a massive, impenetrable defensive wall immediately. She quickly suggested hiring a team of aggressive private investigators to look deeply into my parents' daily lives, their habits, and their associates to find any usable leverage to force them to back down. I shook my head firmly. I looked her in the eye and told her I absolutely did not need to hire a private investigator. I told her to focus entirely on handling the complex court filings and to aggressively delay the mandated psychological evaluation using every single procedural motion and legal loophole she knew. I told her I would personally handle the intelligence gathering and the destruction of their credibility. Sophia looked down at my heavily bandaged hands and asked, with genuine curiosity, what exactly I planned to do. I smiled coldly. I told her I was simply going to do my job. I drove back to my quiet house, locked the front door, and walked directly down the wooden stairs into my basement. The space was completely soundproofed and heavily climate-controlled, housing my private home office. It looked exactly like a high-security corporate server room. 3 high-powered, custom-built desktop towers, a massive server rack blinking with green lights, and a curved, immersive array of 6 high-definition monitors sat on a massive, reinforced desk. This was my absolute sanctuary. This was the exact environment where I systematically tracked down corporate embezzlers, unmasked ghost companies, and ruined wealthy criminals for a living. I sat down in my ergonomic chair and booted up my entire system. The hum of the cooling fans filled the silent room. I immediately connected to a highly secure, encrypted virtual private network and intentionally routed my internet protocol address through 3 different, heavily encrypted proxy servers located overseas. I was absolutely not going to hack into any of their personal accounts illegally. I simply did not need to break the law. Ordinary people, even wealthy ones, drastically underestimate exactly how much incredibly sensitive information is perfectly, legally publicly available if you know exactly where to look, what databases to query, and how to aggregate massive amounts of disconnected data. In my industry, it is called open source intelligence, and when utilized by a professional, it is devastatingly effective. I started my digital hunt with Richard's primary source of wealth, his commercial real estate development firm. I pulled up the official state registry of corporations. I quickly ran his full legal name, Margaret's maiden and married names, and the names of his top 3 executive officers. I opened a terminal window and wrote a highly specific, customized Python script to automatically cross-reference those specific names with thousands of shell company registrations located in tax-friendly states like Delaware and Nevada. I hit execute. Within less than an hour, the script finished running, revealing a complex, deliberately confusing web of 12 different limited liability companies, all secretly connected back to Richard's main holding firm through various registered agents. Next, I accessed the county property tax records and the municipal court databases across 3 different Texas counties. I ran automated searches on every single property legally owned by those newly discovered shell companies. The raw data started aggressively flooding across my 6 monitors. Mechanics liens, official foreclosure notices, dozens of unpaid contractor disputes, and angry civil lawsuits from suppliers. I began to systematically build a massive color-coded spreadsheet. The deeper I dug into the financial records, the more the grand, intimidating illusion of their massive generational wealth began to rapidly crumble into dust. I looked closely at Richard's massive flagship development project, a highly publicized, luxury condominium tower located in downtown Dallas. According to public city permit records, safety inspection logs, and municipal noise complaints, all physical construction on the site had completely stopped over 4 months ago. I dug deeper and pulled the uniform commercial code filings. These are legally mandated, public records that massive lenders file with the state when they have a secured financial interest in a company's physical assets. Richard's various companies were leveraged to the absolute terrifying limit. He had desperately taken out massive, high-interest mezzanine loans from predatory private equity firms just to keep the failing business afloat for another quarter. I then checked the public county records for their beloved $4 million residential mansion. It was heavily, dangerously mortgaged. It was not just a standard primary mortgage, but two massive, additional lines of home equity had been aggressively drawn against the property in the last 18 months alone. The financial picture was crystal clear. They were rapidly bleeding cash. The lavish, incredibly expensive anniversary party was absolutely nothing but a desperate, calculated smoke screen, an expensive theatrical performance designed to project an image of perfect solvency to their nervous investors and judgmental country club friends. But standard corporate bankruptcy, even a massive one, does not make someone desperate or insane enough to literally kidnap their own grandson. There had to be something else hiding in the data, something explicitly criminal. I aggressively shifted my focus away from property records. I directly accessed the federal civil court dockets using my professional credentials. I ran a broad search for any pending active litigation involving Richard's primary holding companies. The federal system spun for a few agonizing seconds before returning a massive hit. It was a massive civil lawsuit, filed quietly in federal court just 3 weeks ago under a sealed motion that had recently expired. A large group of wealthy private investors was aggressively suing Richard for massive financial fraud, formally alleging he had knowingly operated a massive Ponzi scheme, illegally moving funds from new investors to pay off fake returns for older investors in the stalled condo project. They were demanding $40 million in immediate damages, and a formal notice indicated that the Securities and Exchange Commission had already been flagged for a criminal investigation. I sat back heavily in my chair, the cold, blue glow of the 6 monitors reflecting off my face in the dark basement. Richard and Margaret were not just going broke. They were actively facing decades in federal prison, and they desperately needed liquid cash. Massive, untraceable cash to pay off the furious investors or to fund a permanent escape before the federal government officially froze every single asset they owned. They had undoubtedly run a quiet, illegal background check on me recently and discovered the existence of Leo's massive trust. They finally knew about the $32 million. They didn't want to take Leo because they loved him or because they thought I was crazy. They wanted to steal my dead wife's hard-earned money to save their own pathetic skins. The terrifying reality of their financial ruin hung heavily in the cold air of my basement office. Richard and Margaret were not simply desperate to maintain their luxurious lifestyle. They were actively backed into a dangerous, legal corner by the federal government. But discovering the massive Ponzi scheme and the impending Securities and Exchange Commission investigation was only the first piece of the puzzle. Criminals who are facing decades in a federal penitentiary rarely sit quietly in their mansions waiting for the authorities to arrive with handcuffs. They run. And if they were planning to run, I needed to know exactly where, when, and how. More importantly, I needed to know how Leo factored into their desperate escape plan. I turned my attention away from the complex real estate records and the civil court dockets. I needed to access their immediate, short-term logistical movements. Again, I did not need to perform any illegal hacking or breach any secure personal devices. Corporate arrogance is almost always its own worst enemy. Richard's massive development company utilized a third-party corporate travel concierge service to book all of their executive flights and luxury accommodations. I knew the name of the agency because Richard constantly bragged about their exclusive services at family dinners. I ran a targeted, advanced search query, commonly known in my industry as Google dorking, to scan the travel agency's primary web domain for any publicly indexed, unsecured file directories. Within 10 minutes, I found a massive vulnerability. The agency had failed to properly configure the security certificates on their client invoice server, leaving hundreds of digital PDF receipts completely exposed to the public internet if you simply knew the exact URL structure to search for. I filtered the exposed invoices by Richard's corporate billing address. A document from 2 days ago popped up on my screen. I downloaded the file, opened it, and zoomed in on the passenger manifest. My blood ran completely cold. It was a confirmed, fully paid itinerary for a private charter flight departing from a small, discreet executive airfield outside of Dallas. The departure date was scheduled for exactly 4 days from now, late in the evening. The final destination was a small, independent island nation in the Caribbean known specifically for refusing to sign extradition treaties with the United States government. They were permanently fleeing the country before the federal indictments could be officially unsealed. But the destination was not what made my hands shake and my vision blur with absolute, murderous rage. It was the passenger list. There were 3 names printed cleanly on the invoice: Richard, Margaret, and my 8-year-old son, Leo. They were not just trying to win a custody battle in family court. They were actively planning to kidnap my son and take him to a foreign country where I could never, ever reach him. They needed Leo physically with them because he was the sole legal beneficiary of the $32 million trust Olivia had created. Once they had him isolated in a non-extradition country, they would systematically use their emergency conservatorship status to illegally liquidate the trust assets, draining the land sales into untraceable offshore accounts to fund their new, fugitive lives. They were going to use my dead wife's hard-earned money to escape federal prison, and they were going to steal my child to do it. The sheer, calculated evil of the plan was breathtaking. I sat in the dark basement, listening to the hum of the computer servers, and allowed myself exactly 1 minute to feel the overwhelming terror. Then, I shut the emotion down completely. I began to systematically download every single piece of evidence. The flight manifests, the Ponzi scheme lawsuits, the shell company documents, and the bank liens. I was going to bury them so deep they would never see the sun again. I spent the next 6 hours meticulously organizing the massive mountain of digital evidence. I did not just save the files to a single folder. I created a completely airtight, undeniable narrative of their massive criminal enterprise. I transferred the heavily encrypted data onto 3 separate secure solid-state drives. In my profession, if data does not exist in 3 different secure locations, it effectively does not exist at all. I placed one drive in my fireproof home safe, slipped the second drive into my jacket pocket, and locked the third drive in a secure briefcase. It was currently 4 in the morning. I picked up my encrypted mobile phone and made a call I had not made in over 2 years. The phone rang 4 times before a gruff, tired voice answered. It was Special Agent Marcus Thorne. He was a senior investigator for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically working in the white-collar crime and complex financial fraud division based in Dallas. 2 years ago, I had contracted with his division to help them untangle a massive, highly sophisticated cryptocurrency laundering ring. I had saved his entire team months of frustrating work by building a custom algorithm to track the stolen funds. He owed me a significant professional favor, and I was calling to collect it in full. I apologized for the late hour, but my voice was completely steady. I told Marcus that I had a very serious, highly time-sensitive situation involving a massive $40 million real estate Ponzi scheme operating right under their noses in downtown Dallas. I told him I had the shell company structures, the offshore routing numbers, the defaulted mezzanine loans, and the civil lawsuits fully documented and tied up with a neat little bow. Then I dropped the absolute hammer. I told him that the primary suspects, Richard and Margaret, had confirmed fully paid private charter flights booked to a non-extradition territory departing in exactly 96 hours, and they were actively plotting to kidnap a minor child to secure a $32 million trust fund to finance their escape. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. When Marcus finally spoke, all the sleep was completely gone from his voice. He asked me where I was and how quickly I could securely transfer the data to his team. I told him I would meet him at a discreet, 24-hour diner on the outskirts of the city in exactly 45 minutes. I drove through the empty, dark streets of Dallas, the second encrypted drive sitting heavily in my pocket. When I arrived at the diner, Marcus was already sitting in a back booth, nursing a black coffee. He wore a wrinkled suit jacket and looked intensely focused. I slid into the booth across from him and handed over the drive. I spent the next hour walking him through the exact methodology I used to acquire the data, ensuring he understood that every single piece of information was obtained strictly through legal, open-source intelligence gathering and public records. I explained the family court dynamic, the malicious conservatorship threat, and their desperate timeline. Marcus plugged the drive into his secure laptop and began scanning the organized files. His eyes widened slightly as he saw the sheer volume and undeniable quality of the evidence. He looked up at me and asked what exactly I needed from the Bureau. I told him I did not just want them arrested quietly in their mansion. I told him they had filed an emergency ex parte hearing in family court for the following morning to try and legally steal my son. I told him I was going to let them walk into that courtroom, sit on the stand under oath, and commit perjury. I asked Marcus to coordinate his federal arrest warrants to drop the absolute second they tried to execute their plan. I wanted them to lose everything in public. Marcus closed his laptop, gave a slow, hard nod, and told me he would have his federal agents ready at the courthouse doors. The morning of the emergency hearing arrived with a heavy, oppressive Texas heat. I parked my truck a few blocks away from the Dallas County Family Court building and walked the rest of the way. The building was an imposing structure of gray stone and dark-tinted glass, designed to make you feel small and insignificant before you even walked through the metal detectors. I wore a simple, dark, well-tailored suit. My hands were still heavily wrapped in clean, white medical bandages, a stark visual reminder of the violence that had occurred just a few nights prior. I met my attorney, Sophia Martinez, in the busy, echoing hallway outside the assigned courtroom. She looked incredibly sharp, completely unfazed by the stressful environment, holding a thick, black leather briefcase that contained the physical printouts of the financial ruin I had systematically uncovered. She looked at my bandaged hands, then up at my face, and asked if the federal agents were in position. I nodded slowly, confirming that Special Agent Thorne had texted me 10 minutes ago. His team was waiting discreetly in unmarked vehicles in the rear parking lot, monitoring the courtroom proceedings through a secure audio feed. A few minutes later, the heavy oak doors at the end of the hallway swung open. Richard and Margaret walked toward us, flanked by two highly expensive, aggressive-looking corporate lawyers. My parents looked absolutely flawless. Richard wore a custom-tailored, navy blue Italian suit that probably cost more than my vehicle, his silver hair perfectly styled. Margaret wore a conservative but incredibly expensive beige designer dress, accessorized with tasteful, understated pearls, completely masking the vicious, cruel woman who had burned my wife's quilt. They were playing the visual role of the deeply concerned, wealthy, and stable grandparents to absolute perfection. They stopped a few feet away from us. Richard looked me up and down with an expression of sheer, unadulterated contempt. He did not speak directly to me. Instead, he leaned over and whispered something to his lead attorney, a slick, overly confident man named Robert Sullivan. Sullivan looked at my bandaged hands and smirked slightly, clearly believing that the burns were the ultimate, undeniable proof of my mental instability. Margaret refused to even look in my direction, keeping her chin raised high, projecting an aura of untouchable arrogance. They genuinely believed they had already won. They believed their massive wealth and social status made them completely invincible in a court of law. The bailiff opened the heavy doors to the courtroom and called our case. We filed inside. The room was intimidating, lined with dark wood paneling and heavy velvet curtains. The judge presiding over the emergency hearing was Judge Patricia Okonkwo, a stern, highly experienced woman known throughout the state for being absolutely brilliant, strictly no-nonsense, and utterly brutal when she suspected parents or guardians were using the legal system to manipulate or abuse children. She entered from her chambers, taking her seat at the high bench, her sharp eyes sweeping across the room, taking the measure of everyone present. We took our seats at the respective tables. Richard and Margaret sat with perfect posture, projecting calm concern. I sat completely still, my bandaged hands resting quietly on the wooden table. I felt no fear. I felt no anxiety. My heart was beating at a slow, steady, incredibly calm rhythm. I was completely detached from the emotional weight of the room. I was no longer a grieving husband or a stressed father. I was an executioner, and I was simply waiting for the judge to give the signal to drop the blade. The bailiff called the court to order, and the battle for my son's life officially began. Judge Okonkwo adjusted her glasses, looked down at the emergency petition file, and instructed Richard's attorney to begin his opening arguments. Robert Sullivan stood up, buttoned his expensive suit jacket, and walked confidently to the center podium. He spoke with a smooth, practiced cadence, clearly used to dominating these types of hearings through sheer intimidation and polished rhetoric. He painted a tragic, deeply concerning picture of my life. He stated that since the unfortunate passing of my wife 2 years ago, I had steadily spiraled into a deep, unmanageable depression. He claimed I was isolating my son, neglecting my basic parental duties, and refusing to accept financial help from my loving, supportive family. Then, he zeroed in on the primary weapon they had manufactured. He brought up the anniversary party. He described the event not as a vicious attack by my mother, but as a simple, tragic misunderstanding that triggered a massive, violent psychotic break on my end. This is a classic, highly documented psychological abuse tactic known formally as DARVO. It stands for deny the behavior, attack the individual confronting the behavior, and violently reverse the roles of victim and offender. Sullivan claimed, with absolute, terrifying sincerity, that I had become enraged over a minor disagreement and had violently thrown the quilt into the fireplace myself. He then dramatically pointed directly at my thickly bandaged hands, claiming that my burns were the result of a sudden, dangerous impulse to self-harm in front of dozens of horrified witnesses, including my young son. He concluded his opening statement by asserting that I was a severe, immediate danger to myself and my child, and requested that the court immediately grant full, temporary conservatorship and physical custody to Richard and Margaret to ensure Leo's safety and to properly manage his future financial estate. Judge Okonkwo listened intently, her face giving absolutely nothing away. She then permitted Sullivan to call his first and only witness. Margaret took the stand. This was her moment, her grand theatrical performance. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and then immediately began to lie with breathtaking skill. Under Sullivan's gentle questioning, Margaret managed to produce actual, highly convincing tears. She dabbed her eyes delicately with a tissue, her voice trembling perfectly. She told the judge how deeply she loved her grandson, and how terrified she was of my supposedly escalating, unpredictable rage. She completely fabricated an entire history of my aggressive behavior, claiming I regularly yelled at Leo and kept him locked in a dirty, unsafe house. When asked about the fire incident, she wept openly, describing how terrified the party guests were when I allegedly snapped and attacked the fireplace. She looked directly at the judge and pleaded, with an incredibly convincing tone of maternal desperation, begging the court to save her precious grandson before I did something completely irreversible. I sat at my table, watching my own mother commit blatant, calculated perjury to steal my child and my dead wife's money. It was surreal. There was a time, years ago, when hearing her say these terrible things would have broken my heart and made me question my own sanity. But now, armed with the cold, hard data of their massive criminal fraud, her performance just looked pathetic. She was not a powerful, wealthy matriarch protecting her legacy. She was a desperate, cornered criminal putting on a cheap show to avoid a federal prison sentence. When Margaret finally finished her tearful testimony, Sullivan thanked her and confidently sat down, looking extremely pleased with the narrative they had successfully established. Judge Okonkwo turned her sharp gaze toward my table. She looked at Sophia and asked if the defense had any cross-examination or wished to present their counter-arguments. Sophia stood up slowly, picked up the thick black binder, and smiled. Sophia Martinez walked calmly to the center podium, placing the heavy black binder down with a solid thud that echoed in the quiet courtroom. She did not look at Margaret, who was still dabbing her eyes on the witness stand. Instead, Sophia looked directly at Judge Okonkwo. She stated that we would absolutely not be contesting the fact that I reached into a burning fireplace, nor would we waste the court's valuable time engaging in a childish, she said debate about who threw the quilt into the flames. Sullivan smirked, clearly thinking we were surrendering the entire narrative. However, Sophia immediately pivoted. She announced, her voice ringing with absolute, razor-sharp authority, that the entire emergency petition before the court was completely fraudulent. She stated that Richard and Margaret did not care about the physical safety of their grandson, nor were they deeply concerned about my mental health. She declared that this conservatorship filing was nothing more than a desperate, highly calculated, and entirely illegal attempt to seize control of a $32 million trust fund in order to save themselves from impending federal indictments. The courtroom erupted into sudden, shocked chaos. Sullivan jumped to his feet, his face turning a dark, furious shade of red, screaming loud objections, claiming the defense was introducing wild, irrelevant, and highly defamatory conspiracy theories. Richard gripped the edge of his table, his knuckles turning completely white, his polished veneer cracking instantly. Judge Okonkwo slammed her wooden gavel down hard, demanding absolute order. She glared at Sullivan, telling him to sit down, and then turned her intense focus entirely on Sophia, instructing her to immediately back up those massive allegations with hard, undeniable evidence. Sophia opened the binder. She methodically began to dismantle their entire wealthy facade, piece by piece. First, she submitted the certified copies of the massive property deeds and the complex trust documents Olivia had secretly established, officially proving the existence of the $32 million and proving that I was the sole legal managing trustee. She explained that Richard had recently discovered this trust and realized that if he could legally declare me mentally incompetent, he would automatically gain full, unfettered access to those massive funds. Then, Sophia introduced the financial forensics. She submitted the official, publicly filed Uniform Commercial Code documents, the multiple defaulted mezzanine loans, and the crushing, massive triple mortgages hidden on their primary mansion. She laid out the exact, terrifying scope of their financial ruin, completely destroying their carefully crafted image of wealthy, stable grandparents. She submitted the formal civil court dockets detailing the $40 million Ponzi scheme lawsuit currently pending against Richard's holding companies. Sullivan was completely panicking now, rapidly whispering to a pale, sweating Richard. Margaret sat completely frozen on the witness stand, her fake tears drying instantly, her eyes wide with genuine, absolute terror as she watched her entire life's secrets being casually laid out on the public record. Sophia continued her relentless assault. She explained the concept of Darvo to the judge, explicitly outlining how my parents had intentionally provoked the incident at the party, destroying my deceased wife's irreplaceable quilt specifically to trigger an emotional response from a grieving husband, which they could then immediately weaponize in this exact courtroom to steal the trust money they so desperately needed. I watched the judge's face. Judge Okonkwo was reading through the highlighted financial documents Sophia had handed to the clerk. Her expression shifted from professional neutrality to absolute, furious disgust. She looked up from the papers, her eyes locking onto Richard and Margaret with a stare that could melt solid steel. She realized exactly what they were trying to do. They were trying to use her courtroom and her authority to facilitate a massive financial crime and effectively steal a child for profit. But Sophia was not finished. She turned to the judge and stated that while the financial fraud established their motive, there was one final piece of evidence that proved their immediate, terrifying danger to the child. She pulled a single piece of paper from the very back of the binder. Sophia held up the single, printed piece of paper. It was the digital invoice from the corporate travel agency. She formally submitted it to the court clerk, requesting that the judge review it immediately. She stated, her voice echoing clearly in the stunned silence of the room, that this document was a fully paid, confirmed flight manifest for a private, international charter flight scheduled to depart from Dallas in exactly 3 days. Sophia read the details aloud for the official court record. She noted that the destination was a specific, sovereign island territory widely known by federal authorities for explicitly refusing to honor United States extradition treaties regarding financial crimes. She then read the names of the 3 confirmed passengers out loud: Richard, Margaret, and my 8-year-old son, Leo. Sophia looked directly at Richard, who was now visibly trembling, his expensive suit suddenly looking far too large for him. She stated that the petitioners were not seeking temporary custody to protect a child, They were actively executing a meticulously planned kidnapping. They fully intended to take the child across international borders, outside the jurisdiction of the United States, utilizing the child's massive trust fund to permanently finance their lives as wealthy fugitives while leaving me behind with absolutely nothing. The silence in the courtroom was absolute and incredibly heavy. Robert Sullivan, their highly paid, aggressive attorney, literally pushed his chair away from the table. He was a ruthless lawyer, but he was not stupid. He instantly recognized that his clients had used him to facilitate a federal kidnapping plot, and he wanted absolutely nothing to do with the explosive fallout. He did not say a single word in their defense. Margaret let out a strange, choked gasp from the witness stand, covering her mouth with her trembling, manicured hand. Her entire world, built on lies, manipulation, and cruelty, was collapsing around her in real time. Richard stared blankly at the wooden table, completely broken, realizing that the quiet, compliant son he had abused and underestimated for 40 years had just systematically, surgically destroyed his entire life using nothing but data. Judge Okonkwo slowly took off her glasses. She placed them carefully on her desk. She looked at Richard and Margaret, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated judicial fury. Before she could even open her mouth to issue her ruling, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a loud, authoritative crash. Special Agent Marcus Thorne walked confidently down the center aisle of the courtroom. He was flanked by 3 heavily armed, uniformed federal officers wearing tactical vests. Marcus bypassed the seating area and walked directly toward the front of the room. He flashed his gold federal badge toward the bench, officially identifying himself to the judge, and stated that he was completely disrupting the civil proceedings to execute multiple, active federal arrest warrants. He turned toward Richard's table. He looked down at the man who had ordered me to let my wife die to save money. Marcus stated in a loud, clear voice that Richard and Margaret were officially under arrest by the Federal Bureau of Investigation for massive wire fraud, operating an illegal Ponzi scheme, criminal conspiracy, and attempting to flee federal jurisdiction. The officers moved in immediately. They did not care about the expensive suits or the designer dresses. They grabbed Richard roughly by the arms, pulling him out of his chair and aggressively securing heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. Another officer approached the witness stand, ordering Margaret to stand up. She completely broke down, sobbing hysterically, screaming that there was a massive mistake, begging the judge to intervene. But the judge simply watched in cold silence as the officer ratcheted the handcuffs tightly around Margaret's wrists. The cold, sharp click of the metal locking into place was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. It was the sound of absolute, undeniable checkmate. The courtroom descended into a flurry of chaotic, highly organized movement as the federal officers began physically processing my parents for transport. Richard did not fight them. He stood completely limp, his shoulders slumped, his face entirely drained of color. He looked like an old, defeated man, completely stripped of the arrogant, powerful aura he had projected for his entire life. Margaret, however, was still struggling, her expensive high heels slipping on the polished wood floor, her tear-streaked face twisted into a mask of pure panic and disbelief as the officers firmly guided her down from the witness stand. Over the noise of the arrests, Judge Okonkwo picked up her wooden gavel and struck it sharply against the sounding block, demanding the court reporter record her final, official ruling on the matter. She spoke with a voice that carried absolute, terrifying authority. She stated for the record that the emergency petition for conservatorship filed by Richard and Margaret was completely and utterly denied with extreme prejudice. She did not stop there. The judge looked directly at me, her expression softening just a fraction, acknowledging the sheer nightmare I had been forced to navigate. She formally granted me a permanent, lifetime restraining order against both of my parents, legally forbidding them from ever contacting me, or my son Leo, through any physical, digital, or third-party means for the rest of their natural lives. She then turned her attention back to the federal agents, officially stating that she was immediately referring the massive pile of forensic financial evidence, along with the corporate travel documents detailing the attempted international kidnapping, directly to the district attorney's office with a strong recommendation for maximum criminal prosecution. As the officers began to march them toward the heavy rear exit doors of the courtroom, Richard finally stopped. He turned his head and looked back at me one last time. There was no anger left in his eyes, no threats of retaliation, no arrogant demands. There was only the hollow, terrified realization that he had vastly underestimated the wrong person, and that his desperate greed had finally cost him absolutely everything. He opened his mouth as if to speak, to perhaps offer some pathetic, last-minute apology or excuse, but the federal officer shoved him forward before a single word could escape. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them, cutting off Margaret's hysterical sobbing, leaving the courtroom in a sudden, peaceful silence. I sat at the defense table, letting out a long, shuddering breath I felt like I had been holding for 2 straight years. Sophia closed her thick black binder, the sound loud in the quiet room. She turned to me, her professional mask dropping slightly to reveal a genuine, warm smile, and quietly told me that it was finally over. We had won. The massive, toxic shadow that had loomed over my entire life and threatened the safety of my child had been permanently eradicated by the blinding light of undeniable truth. I thanked Sophia, shaking her hand carefully to avoid aggravating my burns, and walked out of the massive courthouse. Stepping through the front doors, the bright, intense Texas sun hit my face, and for the first time in what felt like decades, the light actually felt warm and welcoming. The oppressive, suffocating weight that had constantly resided in my chest, the fear of my parents' wealth, the anxiety of their constant judgments, the terror of losing my son, was completely, entirely gone. I walked to my old, reliable truck, the same truck the valets had sneered at during the anniversary party, and drove straight to the house of a trusted family friend where Leo had been staying during the trial. When I walked through their front door, Leo was sitting on the living room floor, quietly building a complex spaceship out of brightly colored plastic blocks. He looked up, saw me standing there, and immediately dropped his toys. He scrambled to his feet and ran across the room, throwing his small arms tightly around my waist, burying his face into my suit jacket. I knelt down, wincing slightly as my bandaged hands brushed against his back, and hugged him as tightly as I could. He looked up at me, his large brown eyes wide with innocent worry, and asked if the bad people were gone. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice completely steady and filled with absolute certainty. I promised him that the bad people were gone forever, and that they would never, ever be able to hurt us or take anything from us ever again. We walked out to the truck together, holding hands, ready to finally return to the quiet, safe life we deserved. 9 long, peaceful months passed since the day the federal agents dragged my parents out of the family courtroom. The criminal justice system moved slowly, but methodically. Richard and Margaret were denied bail due to their explicit, documented status as extreme flight risks. They were currently sitting in separate, high-security federal detention facilities, awaiting a massive criminal trial that their court-appointed public defenders privately admitted they had absolutely no chance of winning. Their $4 million mansion was. One Tuesday afternoon, I walked to the mailbox at the end of my driveway and pulled out a stack of envelopes. Among the utility bills and junk flyers was a standard white prison-issued envelope. It bore the return address of the Federal Women's Correctional Facility, and my mother's name was written neatly in the corner. I stood in the warm driveway, staring at the envelope. I knew exactly what the letter contained without having to open it. Narcissists do not change, and they absolutely never experience genuine remorse. The letter would be a masterpiece of manipulation. That evening, the house was filled with the warm, comforting smell of dinner cooking in the yellow kitchen. I walked out to the small, detached workshop in our backyard. The air was filled with the rich scent of cut cedar and sawdust. Leo was standing at the heavy wooden workbench, wearing a pair of oversized safety goggles, carefully using a small piece of sandpaper to smooth the rough edges of a wooden birdhouse we were building together. I stood in the doorway, watching him work with intense, happy concentration. He was thriving. His grades had improved dramatically. His anxiety nightmares had completely stopped, and he laughed freely and loudly without constantly looking over his shoulder for approval. He was finally safe to just be a normal, happy kid. We had not touched a single dime of the $32 million sitting in the Austin Trust, and we had no immediate plans to do so. That money was not for buying imported marble or luxury cars. It was a permanent, unbreakable shield, guaranteeing that Leo would always have the absolute freedom to choose his own path in life without ever being controlled by financial leverage. Later that night, after reading 3 chapters of a book about a boy exploring the galaxy, I tucked Leo into his bed. I reached down and pulled the heavy, blue and white star quilt up to his chin. Maggie, the incredible seamstress, had meticulously repaired the burned corner, carefully replacing the charred fabric with new, matching cotton, seamlessly blending the scars of the past into the beauty of the present. Leo sleepily reached out and traced one of the white stars with his small finger. He looked up at me in the dim light of the bedroom and whispered that his mother's blanket was the best thing he owned. He said it made him feel completely safe, like she was giving him a hug all night long. My throat tightened with an overwhelming surge of emotion. I leaned down, kissed his forehead, and told him that he was absolutely right. I turned off the bedside lamp and stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching his chest rise and fall in a peaceful, deep sleep. My parents had spent their entire, miserable lives believing that true power and legacy were strictly defined by bank accounts, zip codes, and the ability to control other people. They had lost everything because of that arrogant delusion. Olivia had understood the truth. She knew that the only legacy that truly matters, the only thing that survives the fire and the test of time, is the fierce, unconditional love you leave behind to protect the people who matter most.